All right. So today we're going to continue on with the civil rights movement. So far, if you look at that essay that I've asked you to, if you decide to write this one, I've asked you to kind of set the stage here, and that is you've got these national organizations like NAACP and CORE, and they have built a network of African Americans in the South and North who are going to try to move forward in the post-war period in ending this segregation system. We've also had the federal government take whatever actions it can. First of all, with the Brown versus Board of Education. And then we've got Truman, who's desegregated the armed forces. The shift now moves to the South, and it moves to the African American population in the South actually standing up to these policies and demonstrating against them and calling public attention to them. And what happens now is that the eyes of the country turn to segregation, our segregation system, in a way that we hadn't done for 70 years. We turned a blind eye to what certain states were doing with its citizens for, again, about 70 years, from the 1880s through the 1950s. The actions in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the kind of bigotry that's coming out, it's unseemly to the rest of the country in the post-war period, this big showdown here. Now, I gave you the manifesto last time, right? I want to make sure that I got this across to you guys. This is a warning shot. The Southern Manifesto is a warning shot to the National Democratic Party. It's a not so subtle warning to the National Democratic Party that if the Democratic Party pursues an ending of our way of life down here through federal intervention and the federal overturning of our state, city, and county laws, well, the Democratic Party should count on Southern white Democrats continuing to vote for that party. This is a warning to them. And this is a very big concern for the National Democratic Party. It's going to make a lot of them wonder, can we afford to alienate all these Southern whites who might not be in the Democratic Party anymore? Now, currently, they won't go to the Republicans, so they're not sure what they're going to do. They had the Dixiecrat thing. But what's going to happen over the coming years is the Republican Party is going to kind of rebrand itself and take on anti-federal government language that plays well with frustrated or angry Southern whites who wanted to keep their system. And I'll deal with that a bit more later. But to come back to what I was saying, the civil rights movement now shifts to the people in the South. And the very first, we got Rosa Parks last time? We did got Rosa Parks, right? We're ready for the SCLC. I didn't talk about what the response was, right? The boycott. Okay. So here's an idea for you, the Southern Christian Leadership Council. One more group that, in this case, very important group in bringing the segregation system to an end. So the Southern Christian Leadership Council is made up of Southern black and white ministers, Southern black and white ministers, who realize that they've got a role to play now in helping organize African American and sympathetic whites in the South towards ending segregation. It's going to take leadership, and they're the ones to step forward. And it makes perfect sense. Most Southern black men didn't hold office. They wouldn't be what we would call orators. They might be a middle-class black insurance salesman. You might be an educator, would have a pretty good chance of it. But then again, there's not a lot of, well, there's some education, but it's restricted. But I guess what I want to get at is there's not a lot of leadership with large groups among African American men and women in the South. But the most natural one is black ministers. They're orators. They get up regularly and speak in front of groups. And what happens now is that the churches of the South, black churches of the South, become the rallying point for the black community to come together and become, call almost like a union as far as like solidarity. We're going to have to act together if we're going to get anything changed. And this is where we see black ministers emerge as the leaders of the civil rights movement, and none more famous than Martin Luther King Jr. So you'd want to associate him with this idea. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., well-educated, great orator, minister, young man, probably in his late 30s, early 40s, emerges as the leader who's got a message for an approach. And his approach is resistance to the civil rights movement, to the segregation laws, but non-violent resistance. We're not going to throw Molotov cocktails into buses in Montgomery. We're going to not use the buses of Montgomery. And so what comes out of this, Rosa Parks' arrest leads to an outpouring in Montgomery of frustrated African Americans who now want to do something. They come to a church. They say, what do we do about this? They talk about the different things, and they decide with the minister leadership, what we're going to do is we're going to boycott the bus system in Montgomery. We're going to refuse to participate and go sit in the back of the bus that is prescribed by city law, says that blacks have to sit here. We're going to resist the segregation system. And the boycott lasts for about 7 months. A lot of the white leadership and white community in Montgomery thought that these, angry blacks at the meeting of this church would give up on this idea. There's no way they could maintain it. Blacks were at least half of the customers on buses in the city, but blacks refused to use the bus. They're saying, we're not going to do it. We're not going to participate in this. They arrange carpools, they walk, they ride bikes all over town, and it goes on and on. But the cool thing is, because they're led by ministers and because it's taking place in churches, it maintains their spirit through a long march. And they get through it. And finally, by the end, middle-class, affluent whites who, especially white women, who are frustrated that their black lady cook hasn't arrived on time, or the woman who's supposed to be walking church kids, because they had a lot of domestic servants and they were late all the time. They were like, because they couldn't use the bus system, they finally started bugging their husbands and saying, this seems kind of ridiculous. And then finally the city is saying, we're losing all this money. The bus system we've lost all kinds of revenue. It's going to cost the taxpayers. So finally the city of Montgomery nixes the law, right? They remove the laws and they say, they desegregate the buses. That's the first success of the civil rights movement on the ground, by people saying we're not going to live with this. And now it's going to spread. But it's going to be dangerous, I got to tell you that, to resist. We'll see a lot of violence unleashed on black activists who try to resist the system as we go forward. And it'll be hard to maintain this momentum. I will say this, Martin Luther King probably is influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. Have you all heard of Gandhi over in India? He stood up to British imperialism with the same approach about 1947-48, which is they came out in large numbers, protested against British occupation policies, and British forces came out and beat them, and they didn't shoot, I don't think they shot many of them, but they brutalized the Indian people who came out to demonstrate. And those images of them brutalizing these people who are coming out peacefully to protest get shown back in England and in France and other Western countries. And it just seems it's such a departure from what the world was supposed to be about after World War II. So finally, the public opinion in England says it's not right for us to continue to treat this people that we've dominated for 300 years in this state of control. And so India gave, finally, the people of India their freedom and to allow themselves to go forward. And that non-violent resistance seems to have been picked up by, I think, by Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders of the South who come out of the evangelical movement. All right. Now, the next idea that I want you to, there's lots of different people who do this ultimately, but what started in Montgomery now comes up to Greensboro. For affluent, middle-class, African-American college students, show up one day. I guess they decide we're going to do this. We're going to resist these policies. They go into a restaurant at a Woolworth department store. They had restaurants at the department store. And the restaurant did not serve anyone but whites. And these 4 young men come in, they sit down at the counter, and they ask for menus. And the waitress comes by and goes, y'all know you can't eat here. If you want food, go around the back and you can order, and we'll put it in paper bags so you can take it with you. You know, that's how it works. And they said, we want menus. And then they're told to leave, and they're like, this isn't right. And so the police are called in, and they're taken downtown, and that leads people of Greensboro to show up at the Woolworth and begin to picket, saying this store, a retail store, is we're not going to shop here anymore because of you don't hire African Americans, you don't let African Americans eat here. You are supporters of this racist policy, which is un-American, and it's not right. Counter protesters come out and say rather mean things to the people and hold up signs that are demeaning. It spreads to, they get arrested. I'm pretty sure they get arrested. But what I'd like you to know now is what begins to happen is Southern white bigots are very upset about the effort of independent black people to try to challenge the system. And so when these students attempt it somewhere else, white, I guess you call vigilantes, we'll deal with this. We don't need the police in here. We'll come in here and as you can see what they're doing here, they're pouring food and such over these students. And I'm sure they're saying all kinds of ugly, horrible things. And they're quite smug and arrogant in their attitudes. But this is just the beginning of Southern whites beginning to unleash on African Americans who try to independently stand up to segregation laws. So it becomes increasingly dangerous for African Americans to risk themselves. Also, when the police do show up, they generally are not kind to these people as they are arresting them. And it takes a lot of bravery to do the things that they're going to do. Okay. The civil rights movement is also now going to try to bring the federal government in because it's really good. Do you think the southern states are going to desegregate on their own? We'd like it if they would, right? The country would like it if they'd say this is a thing of a bygone past and we're different now, but they're not going to do it. And they need outside federal pressure. The nation itself has got to say, you can't do this anymore. That means political will has got to be increased. That means people outside the South have got to say, we're going to do something through the federal legislation. Now, this is your next idea called the freedom rides. An idea emerges among the civil rights movement. I think CORE is especially involved in this one, Congress on Racial Equality. They have an idea. How can we get the courts back into the situation here? They decide that buses, interstate buses like Greyhound, that's interstate travel. You can buy a ticket in Philadelphia for Dallas. That's interstate commerce. That's in the purview of the federal government. And so what they do is they buy, say, a ticket from Philadelphia to go to Dallas. And when you're at the bus station in Philadelphia, there's no segregated waiting rooms. But as soon as you cross over, really into DC had segregation. And then you go into Virginia, it's segregated systems. So the Freedom Riders are white and black college students from the North and CORE delegates or CORE activists get on buses, buy tickets, and as soon as they get into cross state lines into the South, when they get off the bus, they purposefully switch. Whites go into black waiting rooms, blacks go into white waiting rooms, and they're formally challenging the state laws requiring them to not enter into this other room. They do that so that they can bring it into the federal judicial system and at least get these interstate interstate travel to be desegregated because that would fall under the purview. The problem is they don't have a lot of problems when they're in Virginia, North Carolina, but when they get into Alabama and Mississippi, and as this is hitting the news, Southern white vigilantes start getting really violent towards these freedom riders. And they start looking for them. And probably the worst moment all is on a Mother's Day in 1961. A Greyhound bus on a Sunday morning. Some local people, I said after church, they see a Greyhound bus going and they chase it down, force it off the road. They look to see if there are any Freedom Riders on it. There are. They barricade the door and they set the thing on fire. And the only reason these people survive is because they kick out the glass window at the back and they get out of it. This is going to force John F. Kennedy to take action. And that's another thing I wanted to let you know. John F. Kennedy, the newly elected Democratic president, is worried. He has not done much about civil rights. Because he barely won the election against Nixon. I mean, like squeaker election. What happens if the Democratic Party goes forward with anti-segregation laws? Will the Democratic Party be able to win national elections is the big question for him. But this action by violence against the Freedom Riders leads him to ask his Attorney General, who happens to be his brother. By the way, the courts end up taking up this issue because CORE and probably the NAACP enter into a suit against Greyhound and against those states for their segregation policies, and the courts rule that, in fact, they can't do this because it's a denial of the 14th Amendment, equal protection for American citizens. So this is a police officer taking out somebody who's gone into a white waiting room. Finally, after the violence that has been unleashed on the Freedom Riders, the president calls up the National Guard to operate in Mississippi and Alabama to protect these Greyhound buses and to protect these American citizens who are traveling in interstate commerce and who the federal judicial system has said have the right to do this, and that segregation laws are wrong. I should mention this too. There's also been challenges to city parks, public places, city parks that are segregated. And the federal court system has also mandated that cities can't have segregated parks anymore. Some cities like Birmingham decided to shut down all their parks rather than allow white and black kids to play together. It's been their answer. There's something also, Southern whites start talking about massive resistance. They're going to resist this efforts to end their way of life. Let me bring you, there's a long good movie called Freedom Rides. Let me just open up the hyperlink so you can get a little bit more of a sense of what it was like because they use a lot of original footage.
Boarding that Greyhound bus to travel through the heart of the Deep South, I felt good. I felt happy. I felt liberated. I was like a soldier in a nonviolent army. I was ready.
I'm on my way.
I'm sorry, our management does not allow us to serve niggers in here.
The Freedom Rides of 1961 were a simple but daring plan to put blacks and whites on commercial buses. They would deliberately violate the segregation laws.
These people are going from town to town and getting off the bus, Negro men and white women, to provoke acts of violence.
The idea of going into Mississippi and going into Alabama and challenging segregation so frontally is something that alarmed not only those who oppose civil rights, but those within the civil rights community.
I don't question their legal right to travel, but I question their wisdom. Some people can get hurt.
How was that feeling? I'd just like to punch some of them damn agitators right in the face.
There was a mob, looked like 1,000 people. They had these iron pipes.
They were screaming, kill them niggas, and they had babies in their arms.
I asked God to be with me, to give me the strength I would need to remain nonviolent and to forgive them.
We'll take hitting, we'll take beating. We're willing to accept death. But we're going to keep coming until we can ride from anywhere in the South to any place else in the South.
Buses are a-coming.
They also got thrown into jails in Mississippi and Alabama, and they would not post bail. They were protesters, and this was not an easy thing to do. So these college students, white and black, are deeply risking themselves to challenge the system, and hats off to them for doing it. Like a lot of parents are like, we agree that it should come to an end, but I don't want my daughter or son getting involved in this. But these brave people did. I need to also mention to you that because churches, African American churches, are becoming the center for the black community to come together to resist, now the KKK starts bombing African American churches. The most egregious one is in Birmingham, Alabama on a Sunday morning, or maybe, I don't know if it was a night or what, but 8 or 9 young black girls were killed in their Sunday school class because of a KKK bombing. And the Southern police force was not investigating these things. Furthermore, Northern college students are coming to the South and trying to register African Americans to vote and tell them their right to vote. And a couple of Northern college students get killed in Mississippi and thrown in a marsh, and the local police won't look into it. And finally, the federal government through the FBI comes in. And it's really going to take an outside force through the federal government, through the nation, saying we want the federal government to do this. This is all leading us to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, one of your IDs. It's going to take national federal legislation outlawing segregation in public places to force the stubborn southern states to end their state, county, and city laws. But I've also got an idea for you named Bull Connor. Oops.
Eugene
Bull Connor. A couple things are going to happen in this amateur documentary film. Violence. Martin Luther King and the SCLC are going to decide to go to Birmingham, even though Birmingham's dangerous to go to because as it was the most thoroughly segregated city in the South, it felt like it was the capital of segregation in Birmingham. They're going to do a confrontation there. They're going to do picketing. They're going to do boycotts. And they know they're probably going to get a violent reaction there. But they think that the outside of the rest of the country needs to see what is going on in Birmingham and understand the anger, bigotry, and violence that is unleashed against African Americans. What happens in Birmingham provokes Kennedy. And I think Kennedy's kind of hanging back a little bit and seeing what's happening with popular opinion. But popular opinion in America, people are calling up their congressman saying this is ridiculous that this is going on. And I think Kennedy finally feels that he can step out and he's going to call for legislation to end this thing. Also in '63, after Birmingham, there's going to be a large march on Washington. And that's when famously Martin Luther King is going to give his I Have a Dream speech. He says, I have a dream that someday I'll live in a country where I'm not judged by the color of my skin, but by the conduct of my character. Kind of like hearkening back to what Booker T. Washington kind of promised the African American people, that someday you'll be judged by the conduct of your character and not by racism. But that was evidently wishful thinking. So I say this is a documentary film, and it is in that it is a film. It's got film. It's presented as a film. But I think it must have started out as a research paper, and a really good research paper with a good introductory paragraph, and then a good body to support all the things that are said in the introductory paragraph, and then a great conclusion. But then what the guy did, I think, is he just read the thing, narrated it, and then added images to it. He's got one interview with somebody who was a protester at Birmingham. But anyway, I think it's effective and good scholarship too. So we'll go forward with this.
You can never whip these boys if you don't keep you and them separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
In May of 1963, one individual in Birmingham, Alabama, reinvigorated the wilting civil rights movement. Bull Connor, Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety, ordered the use of fire hoses and police dogs to quell demonstrations pushing for desegregation in Birmingham. In an ironic twist, however, by defending segregation so fervently, Bull Connor actually called national attention to the civil rights movement and dramatized its goals. His violent actions brought the immediate end to segregation in Birmingham, solidified his legacy as a symbol of bigotry, and, most importantly, hasten the passage of major civil rights legislation. Starting in the 1950s, dramatic changes began to sweep the entire nation. Following the landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 and the success of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, America found itself amidst an ever-strengthening civil rights movement. In 1962, however, the movement met its first significant setback in Albany, Georgia. The Albany movement was largely a failure. Because it lacked a clear-cut focus and failed to arouse an aggressive response from the police department, the campaign stalled. In August of 1962, the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., left the city of Albany. According to King, the Albany movement's aims were so vague that we got nothing, and the people were left depressed and in despair. Although King left Albany crestfallen, he quickly refocused his attention on finding a way to regain momentum. King and other civil rights leaders sought someone that would display to the world the grim reality of segregation in the South. It didn't take long to find such an individual. Born in 1897, Theophilus Eugene Connor achieved local fame in Birmingham after dropping out of high school and becoming a baseball radio announcer in 1921. Due to his booming voice, Connor earned the nickname Bull and eventually became, according to one publication, one of Dixie's most popular announcers. In 1934, Bull Connor launched his career in politics by becoming a member of the Alabama House of Representatives. Connor eventually would become one of the most infamous men in the South. By 1963, Connor had already gained his reputation for defending segregation at all costs. Over the past 2 decades, he had dominated Birmingham's political scene. Serving as the Commissioner of Public Safety, Connor controlled both the police department and the fire department. Connor frequently used his power to enforce Birmingham's stringent segregation ordinances, or, as he referred to them, our way of life. Bull Connor's Birmingham had become an international symbol of segregation and racism. The city was referred to as Bombingham for the numerous unsolved bombings by the Ku Klux Klan during Connor's reign. In 1962, Connor ordered the closure of over 60 of Birmingham's parks rather than follow a court's order to desegregate public facilities. According to Dr. King, Birmingham was the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. After the failure of the Albany movement, local civil rights leaders implored Dr. King to make Birmingham the next target of the civil rights movement. The Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth told King, "If you come to Birmingham, the movement can not only gain prestige, it can really shake the country." With such a strong incentive, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference began planning for the campaign in Birmingham. It would be called Project C, for confrontation.
I have the feeling that if we can get a breakthrough in Birmingham and really break down the walls of segregation, it will demonstrate to the whole South, at least the hardcore South, that it can no longer resist integration.
Since African Americans comprise 40% of the consumer population in Birmingham, the SCLC decided to target segregation primarily in the business section of the city through economic boycott and prolonged demonstrations. The leaders of Project C also hoped that it would serve as a template for future resistances in southern cities. According to Shuttlesworth, we wanted confrontation, nonviolent confrontation, to see if it would work on a massive scale, not just for Birmingham, for the nation. After small-scale demonstrations in April, the leaders of Project C decided to use a revolutionary new tactic. The final phase of the movement would focus on mobilizing hundreds of Birmingham's youth. On Thursday, May 2nd, the first children began demonstrating. By the end of the day, Bull Connor and his police force had arrested 959 children, ranging from ages 6 to 18. Over the next few days, Connor continued defending segregation at all costs.
Do you think you can keep Birmingham in the present situation of segregation?
I may not be able to do it, but I'll die trying.
Connor ordered his police and fire departments to use dogs and hoses to crush these massive demonstrations. To counter King's tactic of nonviolence, Connor pledged to fill the jails. By May 7th, Connor and his police department had already jailed over 3,000 demonstrators. The situation in Birmingham worsened as Connor proceeded with his relentless attack on the demonstrators. Local business leaders began to change their minds about segregation. Because of the economically crippling effect of the boycott and the state of race relations, the Senior Citizens Committee, a group that represented the majority of Birmingham's businesses, agreed to desegregate lunch counters and hire African American workers. Announced on May 10th, the Birmingham Agreement struck an enormous blow for integration. Bull Connor's extreme actions had clearly backfired, but his violent actions would eventually backfire even more.
Bull Connor's recalcitrant behavior and positions allowed the press to be able to focus thoroughly on what was happening within a movement experience.
Over 200 reporters from local and national media outlets captured Connor's segregationist tactics in pictures and video. The stark contrast of vicious dogs and high-powered hoses with young children dramatically stirred the nation's conscience. As Connor attacked the Birmingham Agreement as capitulation by certain weak-kneed white people, President John F. Kennedy began preparing for a monumental address to the nation. Previously, Kennedy had taken a rather lackluster stance on civil rights for African Americans. However, Bull Connor's alarming actions in Birmingham had alerted Kennedy, along with millions of other Americans, of the dire situation in the South. On June 11, 1963, Kennedy delivered an address on civil rights to the nation.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. Speak, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
Using the momentum from the events in Birmingham, over 250,000 Americans participated in the March on Washington in August of 1963, rallying behind a cry to pass the bill. A year later, President Lyndon...
I'm going to pause there and I'm going to resume the... This is finally when the nation decides they're going to act through legislation, but he didn't mention this. Kennedy makes his speech calling for legislation ending segregation in June, and in November, he is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. And so it will not be Kennedy who signs this bill. The bill will languish in Congress because the Southern bloc of Democratic voters won't vote for it. And it's just going to be hard. So what happens is this. His vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, as he's referred to as, JFK and LBJ, back in the day when they went by. Do you have any relatives, males that go by initials? It's so weird to say in the South. One guy was RJ, another guy was VO. But the funny thing was they weren't actual names. It was when they went into the military in World War II, they were asked, what does RJ stand for? And my wife's grandfather, who was named RJ, he's like, he made up a name, Robert Joseph. Another one with VO. They were just known by these initials. It was weird. But at any rate, JFK and LBJ. LBJ, a Southern Democrat from Texas, had refused to sign the Southern Manifesto, and now is vice president, and he's had a background in the Senate. He now twists arms in Washington. He brings in congressmen and says, if you do not vote for this bill, I will stop federal funding and my next budget from going to your state. We're going to get this thing done. This time period is over. And so in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, signed right here, and you've got LBJ here, and you've got Martin Luther King there, makes it illegal under federal law for a public business to segregate or refuse service to the certain segments of the public based on race. So if you're a theater open to the public and you say that blacks have to sit in this section, that's illegal. And state laws requiring that of businesses are illegal too. Hotels, restaurants, places of business, if you're open to the public, you can't discriminate like this. Nor can you have laws that mandate that kind of discrimination. Do you have to go out and make a friend of a person from another race next week? Does this law require that? It does not. But if you will recall this, remember all those laws, like the ones in Oklahoma where it said a white man and a black man can't go fishing together? There were laws saying you couldn't have friendship with these people. You couldn't love somebody from this other. You couldn't become, shoot pool with people. What this law says is that you cannot force the American people not to have these liberties, to make friendships with other people. It's up to them. And we're not going to have an authoritative government that tells people, American citizens, what they can and can't do in that regard. The next year, they passed the Voters' Rights Bill. Do I have that on there as well, voters' rights? They have to now also deal with the fact that the southern states have disenfranchised most African American voters. And so we now have federal legislation looking over elections. Now, this is the high water mark of the civil rights movement. It has achieved its aim. It has ended segregation. But it has not solved race relations in America. In fact, this is probably the best moment for race relations in America. But now, if you look at your essay topic, I ask you to, what does it say? It says, talk about how the civil rights movement became radical and violent towards the end of the 60s. And that's where we get a turn for the worse. And I have a couple of IDs here for you. And it is Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, and Watts are three IDs together. Now, the Malcolm X, Black Panthers, and Watts are all events having to do with African Americans not in the South. But the background of it is this. Although there's no formal segregation laws in northern, northwestern, and western states, some of them did have segregation laws. While there weren't formal segregation laws in general, there were informal segregation laws. And there were all kinds of restrictions on African Americans, and there was a pervasive racism in America. And you combine that with the difficulty of cities. Cities by the 1966-67 are in real jeopardy because of the suburban movement and all of the affluent people leaving the city. So if you're living in downtown Los Angeles or downtown Knoxville or Detroit or wherever, there's not jobs and there's not economic opportunity and things are getting run down and people won't hire you and there's just this systematic racism that exists. And if you're a young African American male or female, you're not going to get a good job because of this racism that exists. Malcolm X is going to play upon that anger. And there's a natural reason for people to be angry and frustrated, right? But unlike Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King didn't want Southern blacks to be angry and to lash out in violence. They wanted them to make a change, but not to give in to this anger that they might feel justified in feeling. But Malcolm X is going to get a hold of that anger and fan the flames of the anger and create a fire in these cities. This is my take on it. Background of him, probably a product of the Great Migration. Remember how Southern blacks moved to northern cities? I don't know that for sure or when, but he grows up in Detroit, Michigan in the 1950s. His father dies when he's young. I think his father drove a bus for the city. His mother is institutionalized when he's like in junior high. So he basically grows up without parents. And he's living in the inner city area where there's no jobs for a young man like him, and there's poverty everywhere, and he gets involved with petty crime on the streets. He goes to jail for a marijuana offense, I think. And while he's in jail, he meets a radical Muslim cleric, a black Muslim cleric. This is something called the Nation of Islam, which is, I don't know if you know very much about it. It's not very prevalent today that I know of. But lots of parts of Africa are Muslim, and obviously the Middle Eastern area, and they had been dominated by European society for a long time through colonies. And part of the effort to throw off European control of those people got wrapped up into Islam. And so it looked like the white Christian Europe was coming against Muslims. So that ends up making inroads in America among inner city African Americans who begin to turn to Islam and away from Christianity as they look at America's system of exploitation of African Americans. And so he converts to Islam. Now, he calls himself Malcolm X because he takes an X for his last name. He says, I don't know what it was, but it was a European name, right? Is his last name. It could be Wilson. He knows that his ancestors are not Wilson. His ancestors had an African name that has been lost to him because they got taken as slaves. And he does not want to bear the name of the whatever family bought his ancestor. He's not going to bear that name anymore. Now, along with him, there's also the Black Panthers. And the Black Panthers also, mostly in cities, are African American men and women who want to take a more aggressive approach, a more in-your-face approach. They're tired of the violence that remember watching those kids in Greensboro get stuff poured on top of them and ugly. They're mad. And they argue that the only way that we're ever going to be protected, we won't get protected by the police. There's acts of violence against African Americans, and they say we're going to have to protect ourselves by exercising our Second Amendment right to bear arms. And the look of these black men in leather jackets and berets parading with 12-gauge shotguns out in the park and kind of doing militia movements scares the bejesus out of the same group of whites who were offended by what was happening in the South are now afraid by what they're seeing on television, right? So public opinion is now starting to shift. National public opinion responded with sentiment to the ending segregation in the South. But as northern and western and northwestern cities begin to have African American community who come out in a different way, it scares them. I'll also say this, Malcolm X also goes after Martin Luther King. And he starts saying Martin Luther King is paid by white people. He makes up all kinds of accusations against Martin Luther King. And he says Martin Luther King is basically a modern day Uncle Tom. And that his message of passive resistance is weak. We have to stand up for ourselves and fight for ourselves. And furthermore, he starts painting all white people the same. He casts every white person into the category of having exploited African Americans, which is not a favorable thing to do. It's just not, I think he's exploiting the anger of the people to promote himself, to get recognition and to become powerful. But it's not good for race relations in America. In fact, race relations take a really bad turn at this point in time. There's a lot of violence in schools, gangs and such, and violence randomly between whites and blacks, and it's just not a good time. Let me show you a little bit of what he said.
We still feel that we are right and that we stand within our constitutional rights in the protest. And we still advocate nonviolence, passive resistance, and still determined to use the weapon of love. And I can say that there is no bitterness on my part as a result of the decision. And I'm sure that I voice the sentiment of the more than 40,000 Negro citizens of Montgomery. We still have the attitude of love. We still have the method of passive resistance, and we are still insisting emphatically that violence is self-defeating, that he who lives by the sword will perish by the sword.
It has been suggested also that this movement preaches a gospel of violence.
No, the black people in this country have been the victims of violence at the hands of the white man for 400 years. And following the ignorant Negro preachers, we have thought that it was godlike to turn the other cheek to the brute that was brutalizing us. And today, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is showing black people in this country that just as the white man and every other person on this earth has God-given rights, natural rights, civil rights, any kind of rights that you can think of when it comes to defending himself, black people we should have the right to defend ourselves also. And because the Honorable Elijah Muhammad makes black people brave enough men enough to defend ourselves no matter what the odds are, the white man runs around here with the doctrine that Mr. Muhammad is advocating violence when he's actually telling Negroes to defend themselves against violent people.
Reverend Martin Luther King preaches a doctrine of nonviolent insistence upon the rights of the American Negro. What is your attitude toward this philosophy?
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolent. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken the people into captivity. That's this American white man. And they have proved it throughout the country by the police dogs and the police clubs. 100 years ago, they used to put on a white sheet and use a bloodhound against Negroes. Today, they have taken off the white sheet and put on police uniforms. They've traded in the bloodhounds for police dogs, and they're still doing the same thing. And just as Uncle Tom, back during slavery, used to keep the Negroes from resisting the bloodhound or resisting the Ku Klux Klan by teaching them to love their enemy or pray for those who use them despitefully. Today, Martin Luther King is just a 20th century or modern Uncle Tom or a religious Uncle Tom who is doing the same thing today to keep Negroes defenseless in the face of attack that Uncle Tom did on the plantation to keep those Negroes defenseless in the face of the attack of the Klan in that day.
Okay, you see a different message, right? It is unfortunate. He tapped into this anger, and things get a turn for the worse. He ends up being assassinated by members within the Nation of Islam, where he has a falling out with. But what I want to now go to is Watts, and this is the beginning of a series of riots that take place in American cities out of the frustration of impoverished African Americans, lack of economic opportunity, and a history of brutality by police officers white police officers in their community. It happens in Watts in the summer of 1968. Watts is a district within Los Angeles that was primarily low income, primarily non-white, different Asian, Hispanic, African American, and the police force of Los Angeles was a white police force that seemed more like an occupation army. They cruised in the streets, and whenever they apprehended an African American or anyone in Watts, they used strong arm tactics. That is, they were pretty violent with them, and it was simply known that's how the police dealt with it. Well, what happens on this particular day is a black motorist gets pulled over for a broken tail light. And when he is being confirmed by the policeman, he's done with it. He starts verbally attacking the police officer for the police tactics that exist in their community. And that officer decides to call for backup. So more white police officers show up to deal with this unruly African American male who is angry. And then they jump him and they start pummeling him and I guess with bats and such. And the people sitting here watching this ignite. And they come to the defense of this man on the ground. And they start beating up the police officers. Basically, a street brawl between police officers and people from the community. The police officers now flee. And when that happens, you remember when Martin Luther King said, "We reject violence, those who live by the sword," that's self-defeating. Unfortunately, a self-defeating thing now happens. African Americans in the city in the neighborhood where they live now go on what can only be called a rampage. They start breaking into, they break into stores and they steal things and they break out windows, and it's just really self-defeating. And it's born out of frustration and poverty, I suppose, and a feeling of a system that's against them. They finally have to bring in the National Guard. There's fires going on in the city. And now listen, if you're outside of the city and you were, if you were I'm sure many people who were black would look at this and say, oh my gosh, this is the worst thing that can happen. This is going in the wrong direction. But whites in America, they're also now going to be subject to somebody who can, if Malcolm X played upon the fears and anger of African Americans, Now we're going to get political people who play upon the fear that now is growing among the white community, because they look at the city like that and they see what's going on, and now the Republican Party starts talking about it. We're a party of law and order. And what that means is when they take on that mantle, we're going to be the ones to protect America from this kind of inner city crime. And their solutions aren't going to be better education or more investment in these communities, but their answer is more and more police to deal with this. And so we got on a path that we've never really departed from successfully. But we go from there, and it doesn't go well. The 1970s are a time of great racial difficulty in America. Okay. Let me look here a little bit at this New Deal coalition. Lots of strains are about to become to the New Deal coalition. The Democratic Party has been dominant in America since the 1930s. It's about to lose its dominance as the Republicans are going to reemerge as a dominant party for the next 30 years. Between 1968 and 2016? That's a long time, right? There's only been, I think, 3 Democratic presidents, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. Otherwise, they've all been Republicans. So there's this, we're about to have a rightward move in America, and it's going to be for a lot of things that happened in the 60s. But one of the things is this race relations in America. The solid South that used to vote Democrat are going to be wooed by the Republican Party over time. I'll talk about these other groups in a bit, but the Democratic Party is going to become, and by the way, the Democratic Party is going to kind of get torn apart because it's got several different elements to it. As you can see here, it's got Midwestern farmers who are pretty conservative. It's got Northern ethnic whites who are fairly conservative on some issues too. And what I'm going to talk about next time is about court rulings and all these things that happen that are going to upset a whole lot of traditional Americans. I guess I'll leave it at that because we got about 90 seconds left. I normally try to squeeze every minute out, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do it at this moment. Any questions for you guys about all this history? Kind of looking at the way the world has emerged, the world that we live in. That's what's happening in the last couple of weeks of this class. That's where we are. Why is the world the way it is?